Okay, so obviously Democracy Collaborative is the organisation I'm presenting on behalf today. Just a little bit about what we do. What we're trying to do as an international economic think tank is try to really promote a concept called community wealth building. So that's about how we have a very different kind of economy and a much fairer and crucially a more democratic economy. A lot of these things can be done not necessarily by politicians like myself, but they can be done in communities by communities as part of movements, trying to influence politicians and working at the grassroots to build a different economic system which is more fair and equitable than the one that we have currently. There's an economic development model that transforms local economies based on communities having direct ownership and control of their assets. It addresses wealth inequality at its core to produce broadly shared economic prosperity, racial equity, and ecological sustainability. So people might have heard of the Preston model, they might have heard of community wealth building more generally, but it's really about trying to deal with the issue of ownership in our economies, because it's our position that the wealth that we do have in society within our communities are in two hands. So it's basically trying to address the issue of ownership, the fact that basically many communities, especially working class communities and diverse working class communities, especially in London and beyond, they really don't have that ownership stake in their economic lives. They're often working for an exploitative employer. They might be in a company which is not unionised, where they've got very little say. They might have housing conditions which are very difficult for them. And it's trying to basically bring that ownership back into communities through common ownership. So obviously, I presume you've heard of Desmond Tutu. So in terms of community wealth building, he was basically saying there's only one way to eat an elephant, a bite at a time. So that's basically, if you want to try to change the system, you can't do it straight away. You've got to do it over a period of years, and you've got to do it gradually, but you can actually bring about economic system change practically. So community wealth building does that, and it also deals with the big crisis of our time. We've got a climate crisis, we've got an economic crisis, we've got a crisis involving minority communities, women and disabled often are excluded from the labour market. And we could argue we've got a democratic crisis as well. You know, do people have a real stake in their economic lives? I would argue not as much as they should do at this moment in time. And it's through small things and issues like looking at where you buy your goods and services, making housing more affordable, dealing with poverty, tackling gentrification, the cost of living, and promoting better wages. That is what community wealth building is about. So in terms of community wealth building, it's a movement that actually began in Cleveland, Ohio 20 years ago, and it was done to address some of the real severe issues communities had there around deindustrialization. And obviously it goes back to the quite radical tradition in America with Martin Luther King and others around trying to have a real fair democratic economy where every community could share in the wealth they produced. And it's about trying to say that the current way of doing economic development, where we rely primarily on larger businesses to come in and bring wealth to us, that often doesn't work, and it leads to that inequality. And community wealth building is translated to other places globally, including the UK and Scotland. And community wealth building is a concept and a practice. It's been adopted by many communities and across many administrations across the world. And I'll speak about some of the work in London later on, because believe it or not, there's lots of work around community wealth building within London. And obviously a big part of supporting community wealth building is what funders can do and what philanthropy can do, what charities and community-owned organisations can do to support it. So community wealth building has 5 pillars. So it's about fair work. So that's basically saying, do you work for an employer that pays the London living wage? Do you have access to a trade union? Do you have beyond the statutory holidays and the rest of it and sick pay? Looking at locally rooted finance, so that's basically making sure that there's things like credit unions that are supported and community banks and pension funds invested directly within the region. It's looking at the just use of land and property, obviously a huge issue in London with house prices. What are the reasons why that is an issue is because the actual land supply is in so few hands, and how we can use publicly owned land especially to maximise the supply of social and affordable housing. It's looking at progressive procurement, so that's where big institutions and funders as well choose to buy the goods and services. If you're refurbishing your headquarters, can you use a locally based construction business that's family owned that might be down the road rather than using a large corporation, for example, which tends to often extract wealth? And it's looking at inclusive and democratic enterprises. So, there's not enough of these companies which operate in our economy that say might be owned by by the local council doing good for the community, or it might be owned by the community themselves, say a community land trust, or it might be a worker and employee-owned business, for example. We just don't really have enough of these yet. Obviously, things are improving, I believe, slightly at the moment, but obviously not to the scale where I think we need to be. And then this is where London Funders comes in, because a big part of community wealth building is looking at working with what's known as anchor institutions. So in every community, there are hospitals, universities, there are councils, there are utilities, and they employ thousands of people. They tend to have lots of land and asset holdings. They tend to use their procurement budgets in a certain way. And the whole idea with community wealth building is making sure that we actually have a local and regional economy where these anchor institutions think differently. So a hospital, obviously, the reason why you go to hospital is obviously to be healed if you're unwell, or have an operation or whatever. But hospitals often have budgets of £500 million or £1 billion. They often employ. I'll give you some examples. Thousands of people in community wealth will have assets at disposal. The NHS has moved on this a lot. To my politicians that as part of community wealth building, hospitals 10 years ago, other not-for-profits should look to as well now recruit people in areas of these ideas deprivation beyond recruitment minority communities. So what we did in Preston is we looked locally. They should look to use what we had already, land and assets for we as a working class housing in the northwest of England. The highest tried for. So that's what community wealth building is in very large well. They actually work to regenerate our city centre, but public sector institutions, unlike corporations, to bring them in. So going to get up and leave. We looked at something more democratic, obviously yourself as funders, you are also. We have an anchor strategy. So in Preston, we got a university over who you employ. You have a big say over here. We made you wage, have a big say where you buy good businesses, a part of community wealth. Obviously, you can be part of the community wealth building in source services. We work with our public so next question, just from your knowledge, £12 billion. Do you have any ideas? And we persuade them to invest up to 100 million in Preston and South Ribble. We're expanding worker-owned and employee-owned businesses, we've got cooperative development networks that do that. We're establishing the Northwest Mutual, which will be a fully licensed regional cooperative bank, because we're seeing in our communities how the large banks are disappearing from our communities and branches are disappearing as well. We support a credit union and CDFI. We were the first council outside London to become accredited with the Living Wage Foundation. Now, I know the movement towards the London living wage is huge, and it came from London, but we obviously were inspired by what was happening in London and became accredited as a living wage employer. We're looking at municipal ownership and enterprise. So we're developing our city centre primarily in council ownership. We're looking at how we can provide public housing again. We have planning policies which encourage local suppliers and labour across the economy. And then we're looking at things like community land trusts like you have in London, getting the hospital to recruit from the most deprived parts of Preston, looking at the public cooperative and community ownership of energy, and also municipally owned broadband. So we've got a project where we hope to scale up a cooperative where the council's got a large stake, which we hope will provide free broadband, especially in the most deprived communities, to try and tackle some of the inequalities we face. So this is just some of what we've done in pictures. This is us when we insourced one of our venues. That's a former cabinet member on the left and a current one on the right. And insourcing is pretty big in London, because if services are directly provided by local government or the public sector, you have that democracy over what happens within the services, and also you can decide terms and conditions of the staff and other things. We're establishing cooperatives. So this is Preston Cooperative Education Centre. That's working to help establish cooperatives. This is Preston Digital Cooperative, which is a worker-owned cooperative, which is it's been for the graduates, and one of the lecturers was involved in that. So that expertise we have in Preston from our University of stays, and they formed a cooperative business. This is a women-led cooperative called the Mandala Wellness Centre. So there's about 15 women who are involved with this business, and crucially, because it's in worker ownership, they're paid a lot better. The minimum wage there's something like £17 an hour, and they have the say over how that business operates. About 15 employees there that become a worker-owned business. And then this is another cooperative, Brookfield Retrofit Cooperative, because what we're doing with this, and again, this is in one of our working class communities, this business we want to scale up, we want it to win contracts from our local housing providers. So whereas there might be 2 or 3 people in this retrofit cooperative now, if they can win a contract from, say, a housing association, there could be 50 or 60 in it. And then this is a different type of cooperative. This is our traveller community. They were facing eviction. The council acquired the site, and we basically worked with them to establish a housing cooperative called Leighton Street. And that was a day that they found out they weren't being evicted. So as a politician, they were being warmly welcomed when you're in communities. But when I do go down there, I'm usually very warmly welcomed by the communities there whose houses that we actually saved through establishing a cooperative. And then this is going to be the first community land trust in central Lancashire. So this is in Plungington, that's the ward I represent. And obviously we're working with our local church here to convert this building to 21 socially rented properties. But also it's going to be actually owned by the community as a land trust. So it's very exciting. And again, working with the faith sector to promote community wealth building is where a lot of potential is. As I mentioned before, this is how we're establishing a multi-stakeholder cooperative vehicle that will offer low-cost Wi-Fi to help people get online across the city. So this is Preston Digital Cooperative. So again, it's basically not the large utility providers. We're actually establishing an alternative which we hope will get people online and beam free Wi-Fi into people's homes for many community centres. So that's community wealth building as well. And then, I'm not sure if anyone's a fan of Ed Sheeran, but just before he became famous, he played in the Ferret, which is quite an iconic small venue within Preston. And again, there was a real issue there where the landlord was wanted to sell the property, but what we did as a council is we lent them a loan and we encouraged them to move into community ownership. So this is now a venue that's owned by the community. We're not at Ed Sheeran back yet, sadly, but obviously the venue is still there for the community, and it's run and owned by the people who are involved with the Ferret. So that's a little taste of community wealth building. So it started in the American Rust Belt, and obviously it then came to Preston about 10 years ago, and it's then spread ever since. So obviously this is a London audience, and I know I'm speaking in a northern accent about things in the north of England, but there's a bit of a movement towards community wealth building in London, across the UK and beyond. So I'll just give you some examples of how community wealth building is it's really advancing across the United Kingdom. So we've got insourcing of services that's pretty wide, and this is especially in the larger councils, which London is. So Islington Council, for example, they've insourced, I think, 300 million plus of services back into the council. And that has meant that I think 1,400 staff have received the London living wage just by insourcing those services back. And obviously, it's generally more often than not that if things are run more directly by councils rather than outsourcing companies, there is a better service for the community. The Welsh Assembly is helping establish a community bank called Bank Cambria, like we're doing in the northwest of England. And they're establishing or have established publicly owned construction companies. You have ownership hubs, and I'll come on to that later, in Sheffield, Manchester, West Midlands and Greater London. You've got Hackney and North Ayrshire that are developing municipally owned energy companies. There's a conversation about Great British Energy at the moment about how that's going to expand ownership energy production, but a lot of it's been happening before that by local councils. Scotland has pioneered a community wealth building approach with the Community Wealth Building Act. So they're putting legislation across Scotland that will deliver community wealth building across the whole country. And the NHS long-term plan, which is about 5 years old, it talks about hospitals now as an anchor institution. So many hospitals are looking at where they can buy goods and services. Can they recruit from the most deprived communities? Can they use their estate to tackle net zero? And can they use some of the buildings for, affordable housing and community organisations? And then we also have the Civic Universities Network. And I'll come on to what's happened in Greater London, which is the Greater London Anchor Institutions Network, which I'll come on to next. So some of you might have heard about this. This is an initiative by the Mayor, Sadiq Khan. So what it's done is it's brought together public and not-for-profit institutions. So that's the hospitals, the councils, the universities, religious institutions, some charitable organisations as well, like yourselves, into a network. And what they're doing is they actually have organisations that have a budget collectively of £73 billion. So just imagine what you can do if you coordinate where you're spending, where you're recruiting, and what you can do with your assets. So what they are doing is they're obviously looking at how they can use the recruitment and procurement power to get Londoners, especially young people as well, into good work that pays a London living wage. And they're looking also at how they can double the size of London's green economy by 2030 and tackle net zero. So a big part of community wealth building is looking at the institutions that aren't going to get up and leave, like a museum, a hospital, a university, or a council, and making sure that that is spent locally, recruiting people in areas that have highest unemployment. They're using the land for socially productive means, supporting more democratic companies through establishing cooperative businesses and beyond. So obviously, London Anchor Institution Network is really brilliant, but I do think they probably need to go a little further to really do full fat community wealth building. But the fact it's there and the fact it's doing what it's doing now is very positive. And I think what they have done as well is they've actually, I think, spent another £500 million with London small businesses. And a lot of London's small businesses are minority-owned businesses, so they're owned by people in minority communities often who suffer often a little more poverty in our society. And then Newham, they launched a community wealth building strategy. This was Roxana Fiaz, who's the mayor. She launched it in 2020. They're doing some very amazing things, like, again, promoting the London living wage, but they're actually buying up former council houses and privately owned housing by the local council to try and address homelessness, because the cost of housing is a huge issue in London. So Newham adopted a community wealth building strategy. This is Islington Council. This is the cabinet member Santiago Bell Bradford. And again, they've adopted a very strong community wealth building strategy as well. So you're seeing London councils on this, you're seeing the Mayor of London on this, and you're seeing obviously the London Anchor Network. So, this is happening amongst us now. Community wealth building is beginning to build. I would argue it's not the scale it needs to be, because this needs to be the primary way we do economic development. But there's a huge potential with community wealth building, that conversations about where we spend, the ownership of the economy, putting more businesses in the hands of workers and communities and more organisations. This is a conversation that's growing both across this country in London and also across the globe as well. And then this is the London Ownership Hub. So I believe the Deputy Mayor is there. And this is obviously something that was established with external funding to encourage business owners, basically when they're retiring or when people are establishing a business, to set them up as a cooperative or work with an employee-owned business. Because I don't know if any of you shop at John Lewis. I know it's a bit posh, maybe for people up in the north, but we've got one here. But John Lewis and Waitrose, that is actually an employee-owned company. So the democracy you have when you vote for your local council or your local MP, a lot more of that is within these worker and employee-owned businesses. And we're basically saying that we need more of this as part of community wealth building, to have a much more fair local economy where people actually have ownership of the more ownership of their working and economic lives. And just a few other things around the country. This is Steve Rodden on the left, he's the Metro of Merseyside, Greater Merseyside, and they're supporting an expansion of community land trusts. Now, I know we've got a few of these in London, but again, this is very interesting that what they are doing is they're looking at publicly owned land and other land where they can have a network of community land trusts. So you have cooperative housing that's affordable for communities and actually owned by communities. Very, very positive. And then I talked about the North West Mutual we're establishing. In Wales are looking to establish a regional cooperative bank because our banking system in the UK, I would argue, it's very extractive. It's dominated by a few very large corporate-led banks, and I presume some of you are old enough to remember the financial crash of 15 years ago where we all had to bail out the banks, and the payback for that was austerity. If you go to Germany, you've got a banking system which is much more diverse and is actually generally supporting not-for-profit, cooperative and publicly owned banks. And obviously, we're establishing a bank in the northwest of England. In Wales also, we're looking to establish a banking alternative. And the idea is that some of the branches that we've lost from our communities by the large banks who often shut them down because it's more convenient for them, cooperative banks will actually reopen some of them. So that's Bank Cambria in Wales. And then also, this is the Northern Ireland Assembly. They've done a report to advance community wealth building in Northern Ireland. Now, there's been a few political issues there with the Stormont being, stalling, basically not meeting because there's political differences and then reopening. But again, they're looking at community wealth building in Northern Ireland too. And then also, very excitingly, there's community wealth building overseas. Just because we started a very different conversation in Preston, for example, I tend to get visited a lot, which is lovely actually. But it's also very exciting because people want to have a bit of hope in our economic system, a very different economic system. So there's growing interest in community wealth building. I've had visits in the last 12 or 18 months from Norway, Germany, France, South Korea and Ireland. I actually went to South Korea 6 months ago, talking about community wealth building with the Democracy Collaborative. City of Sydney, the Sydney Council in Australia, they're looking at a community wealth building strategy. San Francisco and Los Angeles are looking at how they can establish publicly owned banks that will benefit people rather put people before profit. New York City's expanded worker-owned businesses, which you don't expect to see that in America, but they are doing that in America. And Chicago's launched a $15 million citywide community wealth building pilot. Amsterdam and Barcelona are also adopting citywide community wealth building approaches. And then trade unions in America, especially in Cincinnati, are looking at how they can support worker-owned businesses. So businesses are actually owned by the people who work within them that they control, but also that trade unions back as well. So a few more examples of this. So we have the Evergreen Cooperative. So this is what inspired the Preston model. This was so inspiring. So you had a situation in Cleveland, Ohio, where there was so much inequality. You had multimillionaires on one part of the city that could expect to live to about 88. And then you had, a much less well-off, mainly African-American population where the economic conditions were that dreadful. The average life expectancy was 64 years of age. So what they did in Cleveland, Ohio, through a foundation, and this is similar to London Funders, the Cleveland Foundation it was called, what they did is they actually worked with the not-for-profit museums, universities and hospitals, the charitable ones in America, not the private ones. And they actually started saying, well, we're going to buy a lot more goods and services from the city economy, but we're also going to direct some of those purchasing strategies to establish new businesses that are actually going to be owned by those communities and in those areas where inequality is so bad. So they established a number of businesses that were worker-owned businesses, and it's pretty amazing what they've done. There's 400 employers currently. Many of them have actually been in prison, mainly for minor offences, that are working within them. They all receive a living wage, and they also share the profits. So for many of the people who work in these businesses, the idea of actually owning a car or a home was something that was impossible for them because of their economic conditions. But the Evergreen Cooperatives, which has been supported by the not-for-profit institutions buying from them, have actually given people in those communities hope, which is brilliant. So that was inspiration. So this just shows how this is a global movement. It's not the main way that we do economics, but potentially it could be in the next couple of decades if enough people shout about it and fight for it. And then this is the City of Sydney Council website. So it just shows how the City of Sydney is looking at community wealth building. And they're looking at how they can adopt the principles of community wealth building. So it's very significant when you've got capital cities like Sydney and Amsterdam that are actually exploring how they can adopt community wealth building to reduce inequalities, it says there, and ensure more people share in the city's prosperity. And then this is a former mayor of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot. She started supporting community wealth building in parts of Chicago because obviously the African American community there, the inequalities are really, really that bad. You need to do something that isn't skirting around the edges. So that is why she is supporting, or did support, worker-owned businesses for people within that community. She did support community land trusts and cooperatively owned housing because, you know, there's a system problem that's making people that poor, and it's often amplified based on, you know, ethnicity, gender, and disability as well. In youth, you could argue too. And then, very interestingly, I was invited to the European Parliament to talk about community wealth building there, and that's me on a panel. Sorry I don't look particularly happy, but well, that's me on a panel there. And very interestingly, a lot of the mainstream centre-left parties are looking at community wealth building now across Europe, looking at it as how they can potentially counteract the far right, because you're seeing often far right parties are beginning to gain traction across Europe, and community wealth building is looking at ways that can potentially win back some support politically as well within those communities. So obviously the European unions are looking at this to a degree, community wealth building too. And then this is a former President Joe Biden. So community wealth building became something that he started looking at. And what the former Biden administration did do is he made sure that the federal procurement budget, a lot more of it was there to support local businesses, especially minority and women-owned businesses. So businesses, everyday businesses that are actually within communities in America did receive a lot more federal government contracts. So again, what we've all got to look at is the trend. And what you see with community wealth building is something that probably nobody had heard about 5 or 10 years ago. And it's now, you know, embedded in many communities. It's been supported by many institutions. The NHS, as I said, are looking at parts of community wealth building. It's been supported politically to a degree. I think the key thing is for those who believe in it, how we can actually bring that to scale. And I think what London funders are doing, I know there's often a big push towards really tackling some of the social inequalities that you have within London through the work that you do. I think the more organisations in London funders that can potentially become a supporter of community wealth building or influence people to become supporters of community wealth building, and then we can do a lot to tackle those inequalities and move to a very different kind of economic system locally and regionally, where there's more opportunities, there's more wealth in more hands, and there's more agency people have from day to day in the working and economic lives. So obviously, does this all work? I mean, there are some studies that show that community wealth building does work. So, I mean, there's evidence for every 1 million of spend put back into a local economy, you can expect additional jobs. You see a reduction of unemployment in areas undertaking community wealth building policies, 5% decrease compared to areas that don't. You see that more employee-owned firms are more productive. A study in Preston that showed that, you know, because we did create a lot more living wage jobs by buying locally, there was a small improvement in people's mental health. And then also, we do know that when we do spend with local firms, or anchor institutions, or a charity spends more with local firms, there's a 25% more benefit to the local economy than spending with large firms, for example. So these policies work as well. And I think where we are as a society and what we can all do to bring about change in our communities does need community wealth